a story recently about the old Irish cop from Boston, and this is back in the days when the communists used to have their rallies in the big cities of the country, and of course they had them in Boston, they had them in New York, they had them in the big cities, and up in Boston there always used to be a little bit of a problem because the Irish guys would come down and they'd mix it up with the commies, and on this particular day the cops had to be there, they knew they had to be there, and the commies are having their rally, and the bayous come down and they wade into them, and there's a melee, as they said, and all of a sudden the cops had to go and break it all up, and there's a cop and he's got this guy down on the ground and he's pounding him. And the guy looks up and he says, "What are you hitting me for? I'm an anti-communist." And the cop said, "I don't care what kind of a communist you are," and he hit him again. I heard the story about the mother that's having trouble getting her boy go to school. You know, we hear a lot about the decline of America's educational system, and it certainly is, unfortunately, declining. And this mother's having a terrible time getting her boy to go to school, and she keeps saying, "You gotta go," and he says, "No, I don't want to go." "You gotta go." "No, I don't want to go." They're arguing and back and forth, and he finally says, "No, I don't want to go." He says, "The teachers hate me, the students hate me, even the janitor hates me. I don't want to go to school." And she says, "But you've got to go." And he says, "Give me 2 good reasons." She said, "All right, 2 good reasons why you have to go to school. You're 45 years old and you're the principal." Can it get that bad? Yeah, somebody said, right. One more then. There was a boy who went to Sunday school, and he was all excited. He came home from his mother to his mother, and he says, "What a lesson they gave us today. It was really something." She says, "Well, tell me all about it. Tell me about it." He says, "Well, it was a story about when the Jewish people were being chased out of Egypt by the Pharaoh's army, and the Pharaoh's army was chasing them, and they were getting caught up to them, and they were really getting in trouble, and they got all the way up to the Red Sea, and they couldn't get across, and here comes the Pharaoh's army down on them. They're really in trouble." He says, so Moses got on his walkie-talkie and he called in the Israeli Air Force, and they bombed the Egyptian army, and then the Israeli Navy came across the Red Sea, picked them up and took them to safety. And his mother rolled her eyes. She looked at him and she says, "Is that what they taught you in Sunday school?" And he said, "Well, no, Mom, but if I told you the way they told me, you wouldn't believe it." You see, the boy was skeptical about something he should have believed. And here we have in our country today all kinds of people believing a lot when they should be skeptical. All right, now what should they be skeptical about? Well, we could go on and on just on that subject, but let's just focus on one thing. They should be skeptical about what is called money in the United States of America. They should be skeptical about an organization called the Federal Reserve. Let's talk about that for a bit here. We go all the way back to 1910. We get back to 1910 and we find that there are 7 individuals, each of whom has a connection of some kind to the banking empires in our country. And each of them is told to proceed quietly and furtively to a railroad car in New Jersey across the Hudson River from Manhattan, and to go there, especially go there one by one. Don't go 2 by 2. Don't be seen with anybody else. If any of you are seen with another, there will be all kinds of suspicions raised. We don't want that. Proceed quietly, extraordinary secrecy, to this railroad car. Now you can see them going with the collars turned up and the brims on the hat down and maybe even sunglasses. And each of them did go, and they did proceed. They got to the train. Now who were they? Well, the 7, there were 3 of them from the J.P. Morgan banking empire. There was one from the Rockefeller banking empire. There was one who was an assistant secretary of the United States Treasury. There was another who was a U.S. senator from Rhode Island named Nelson Aldrich. In fact, he owned the train. He had a descendant too, didn't he, called Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. And the 7th individual was a German immigrant to our country named Paul Warburg, who was an agent of the Rothschild banking empire in Europe. Now we know a lot about the details of the meeting because one of the individuals, in fact the Rockefeller agent, a man named Frank Vanderlip, wrote an article about the meeting 25 years later, and it appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935. And in that article, he described the extraordinary secrecy, and he said, "I felt very much like a conspirator," which was a well-chosen word. Now, they were there to gather on the train. The train then proceeded all the way to the southern part of the United States. They got disembarked in Georgia, and they went to a resort called Jekyll Island, where they met in somewhat freedom because nobody knew who they were in Jekyll Island, Georgia, and they planned the Federal Reserve System. The chief of the planners was Warburg, the man from Europe who had experience in a central bank. This is what they were anxious to start, a central bank. Now, our country had experienced central banks. We had had two of them in the past, and in both cases it was found to be absolute disaster, and they got rid of them. In fact, Andrew Jackson spent the 8 years of his presidency to get rid of a central bank at the time. And he not only got rid of the central bank, which is concentrated economic power in one repository, very dangerous thing to do. He not only got rid of the central bank, he proceeded to pay off the national debt. And I sometimes say, Andrew, where are you? Right? Come back. Now, they were operating on the dictum of the leader, the founder of the Rothschild banking empire, a man named Meyer Amschel Rothschild, who 200 years before our time had stated, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." Now, that might seem a little bit excessive to some people who aren't familiar with what we're talking about. If you have control of a nation's money, are you in a position to be able to dictate what kinds of laws are? Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen. It's the corollary on the golden rule. Right? We all know what the golden rule is, but there's another one, and the other one says, "He who has the gold rules." Right? Meyer Amschel Rothschild said, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." So what they wanted to set up was the equivalent of what the Rothschilds had done in many nations in Europe. See, Meyer Amschel Rothschild had a bunch of sons, and he sent one to England, and one to here, and one down to Naples, and one over to Germany, and they set up national banks in these countries, and then they were able to dictate an awful lot what went on in that country. That's exactly what these people wanted for the United States of America. So the legislation was actually concocted by these people. It was then introduced into the Congress of the United States, and it was passed on December 22nd of 1913, signed by the President. We now had the Federal Reserve System. And the date is significant. The date is 3 days before Christmas. It was December 22nd of 1913. That's only 3 days before Christmas. Well, a lot of the individuals in the U.S. Congress who were opposed to the idea of a central bank came from the West and the South. And a lot of them had left Washington in order to proceed to their home districts to celebrate the holidays in their home districts. And those who were left were mostly from the liberal Northeast, who could be counted on to go along with what these people wanted. Now, what does the Federal Reserve do? Well, first of all, let's realize that it is not a federal agency. It's not a government agency. It is no more a government agency than is Federal Express, the package delivering company. Just because the name's federal in it doesn't make it a government entity. So it's a private entity, right? And what it can do is it has control of the amount of currency in our country and therefore the value of the currency. It has control over the interest rates. You remember just, was it a month ago that Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve, decided he was going to raise interest rates on one category of interest 1/4 of 1%, and the stock market went down 100 points. Right? And the president said, "Gee, I wish you didn't do that." Right? Well, he did it. He has uncontrolled power. He can do that. So the Federal Reserve can set the value of the money, the amount of money, the interest rates, and the Federal Reserve also sets the policies for banks in the United States of America. It controls the banking interests. And it has vast powers that nobody has ever really gotten inside it to the degree to bear all its secrets, all its progress, all of what it's done, all of what it's done to our country, and even who owns it is not completely known. In 1968, there was a congressman who was the head of the House Banking Committee, a man named Wright Patman, a very powerful congressman from Texas. And he was an opponent of the Fed. He didn't like all this power in one repository, and he fought against them. But he was never successful in getting to it what he wanted. He wanted to see it opened up and bared and so forth. Finally, in frustration, he wrote a note, a constituent's letter to his folks back in Texas. And in it now, this is 1968, here's what he said. In the United States today, we have in effect two governments. We have the duly constituted government, that being the Congress, the courts, the president. And he said, then we have an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government in the Federal Reserve System operating the money powers which are reserved to Congress by the Constitution. See? That's kind of saying, look, I've tried, and I haven't been able to accomplish what I would like to see done. Well, less than a year later, the Nixon administration had come into office, elected in '68, took office January '69, and a few months down the road, the new Secretary of Treasury, a man named David M. Kennedy, was interviewed by U.S. News and World Report. Question and answer format. Here's the question they asked. Do you approve of the latest credit tightening moves of the Federal Reserve Board? And the Secretary of Treasury of the United States government said, it's not my job to approve or disapprove, it's the action of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has that immense kind of power. Now, the Federal Reserve can increase the quantity of currency and cause a little bit of a boom. It can withdraw some currency and cause a little bit of a downturn. It can cause an up, it can cause a down. It can cause a boom, a recession, an uptick sometimes they say, or a little bit of a downturn. And it can do it with impunity. It can do it whenever it wants. Can it do it just prior to an election? And shape the thinking of many of the voters in our country as to whether we should retain this man in office or whether we should get somebody new? Yes, it can. Has it ever done so? Well, let's look in here. We'll see, we've got a quote here that's very interesting. In 1988, the decision had already been made that the opponents for the presidency in the election of 1980 would be Bush and Dukakis. And here's a man named Monroe Carmen, and he writes an article, again in U.S. News and World Report. And here's what he says. In short, the central bank, that's the Fed, wants to strike a pose of neutrality for the contest between Bush and Dukakis. The Fed will neither plunge the economy into a recession, as Fed Chairman Volcker did in 1980 to sabotage Jimmy Carter's chances for re-election, nor open up the money spigots wide, as Arthur Burns, Fed Chairman, did in 1972 to help Richard Nixon win another term. There it is. In 1984, columnist William Safire of the New York Times, he wrote in his column about this very same power, whether it can shape elections or not. And this is the midterm of the Reagan administration. He said here in his column, William Safire, now the political key. A presidential candidate wants a Fed chairman who will swing a little. Comes the spring of '84, if interest rates are climbing upward and hurting housing, the incumbent will want a Fed chairman to start shoveling money like mad, even if it hurts and upsets conservatives. See, the Fed can shape the thinking of... You thought you decided who was going to be the president, didn't you? Does the Fed help to decide that? You bet your life it does, and that's been going on for a long, long time. Now let me give you an example of what the Federal Reserve does by referring to a fairly unusual source of information. I always say if you keep looking around, you're going to find some things that occasionally turn out to be valuable pieces of information to make your point. And I've got one of those. I've got an article here from National Geographic magazine, January 1993, only 14 months ago. I'll bet there are people in this audience who have it in their homes. Right? There's an article in here, it's called The Power of Money. And it's written by an editor of the magazine named Peter White. And he talked a lot about the different kinds of money that are being used throughout the world, and he talked about what had been used over history and the machinations and the power of money and so forth. It's a very interesting article. But at one point he went to the Federal Reserve. So he gets to the Federal Reserve, and as he gets there he finds out they've just purchased $100 million worth of treasury bills. So he asks some questions. He said, where did you get the money? And the Fed official says, we created it. It's money that didn't exist before. Now, is there anybody in the room that would like that power? I see a few hands, right? There's one fellow with both hands up. But he pressed on, and he says, is there any limit on that power? And here's what the Fed official said. No limit, only the good judgment and conscience of responsible Federal Reserve people. Sleep well, my friends, sleep well. But he pressed on. Where did you get that vast power? And the Fed official says, it was delegated in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, based on the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the power to coin money. And he stopped pressing on. What does coining money mean? It means taking metal, smashing it into little discs, which if you drop them on a hard surface will go clank. Can you do that with paper? Will the paper go clank? Can you coin paper? No. Does the Congress have the power to coin money? Yes. Yes, that's proper. That's in the Constitution of the United States. Does the Congress of the United States have the power to take what it has been given for power and give it to a private entity? No. Does the Congress of the United States have the power to coin paper? No. Nobody can coin paper. You can't give anybody the power to do it. And so therefore Congress can't give that to the Fed either. What we have here is a totally illegitimate power that is being exercised all the time. Now, where did that $100 million that they used to buy those treasury bills, where did it get its value? You know, ladies and gentlemen, it wasn't even printing press money. It was a computer entry. Somebody pushed a few buttons on a computer. Or it was writing in something at the bottom of a ledger sheet, which they don't do anymore. It was a computer. Where did it take on its value? How did it get its value? Very simple. It stole a little bit of yours. It stole a little bit of every piece of currency you hold. Everything that you hold, any money that you hold became less valuable because they introduced new money into the system and it took on, that's the definition of inflation. That's exactly what inflation is. And the Federal Reserve can do that every day of the year. And it can do it twice a day. And it can do it whenever it pleases. And there is no control on that. Now, what has happened because of the Fed constantly increasing the quantity of currency? Well, when I was a boy, I could go and buy a loaf of bread for a dime. And today, my wife sends me out for a loaf of bread, and it costs $1.40. Is it because the bread has increased in price that dramatically? Not at all. In fact, the bread probably costs less because of improved production techniques. What has happened is the value of the currency has shrunk that much. I tell a story in my book about a man who inherited $10,000 in 1940. And for whatever his reasons, he put the money in the bottom drawer. At that point, he could have bought a fine home, but he didn't. And 50 years later, he took the $10,000 out of the bottom drawer and he couldn't even put a down payment on a fine home. Where did the value of his money go? I have just described to you inflation. Inflation is a process that socialist John Maynard Keynes once said not one man in a million can diagnose. Which is not so, because the Birch Society has been telling people for years what inflation really is. And a lot of people now realize that there's only two sources of inflation. The Federal Reserve and counterfeiters, which is redundant. Now, the Federal Reserve then goes to its friends in the government of the United States and said, hey, go after those guys. We don't want any competition. So counterfeiters are a pariah, and they go after them, they stop them, and they do everything they can to stop them. But the Federal Reserve can do what it pleases. And its process is exactly the same as the counterfeit. That's why counterfeiting is wrong, because it's worthless, but it takes on value by stealing a little bit of the value of everybody else's. So what do we do about the Federal Reserve? Do we get the right people in there to run it correctly? Right? Do we take the powers that it has and transfer them instead to government? No, in both cases. The Federal Reserve has to be abolished. And what we have to do is get back to what we had before the Federal Reserve, and that's precious metal currency. And it could be paper, as long as there's something in the warehouse behind the paper, issued by the United States Treasury. That's what has to be done. And it's an immense problem. Now, there are really two subjects when we talk about my book. There's two subjects. One is horrible debt, and the other is horrible financial manipulation. And we've already talked about the manipulation part. But what should our country be? Our master of ceremonies here did a very nice job of summarizing the United States of America. Just a few sentences. He got back to the basics. If you go back to the beginning of our country, you see in the Declaration of Independence where it says the most thunderous assertion ever in the history of our nation, men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Thunderous assertion. We didn't get our rights from government, we got them from our Creator, which incidentally you can't even teach in the government schools today in our country. Imagine that. Well, not only that, then they went on to describe what government is. They said to secure these rights, governments are instituted. There you go. There's the philosophical underpinnings of the United States of America. The Declaration has the philosophy, The nuts and bolts came later in the Constitution. So we fought a war, didn't we, to make this stick. And we beat the British. And we sent them back across the sea. And I'm very glad about that, not just because I have Irish ancestry, but that enters into it, right? So they fought the war under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress before that, and then after it was over, they got together to revise the Articles, and they decided to discard them, and they come out with a whole new governmental system, the Constitution of the United States of America. Here's the whole Constitution right there. Look how many pages, right? You know it couldn't have been written by government today, right? It'd be that high off the floor. Whom does it limit? Does it limit you and me? You know that. No, it doesn't. It limits government. Government is given perfectly proper powers, and then that's all. And then diffusion of powers, separation, checks and balances, everything they could think of. Let government exist for its proper purpose and no more. Then they sent it to the states for ratification, and some of the states, especially North Carolina, said, you know, it'd be better if we had added to this statement, what do we believe our rights to be? And so a pact was made, and the pact said, get the Constitution ratified, and we'll add to it a Bill of Rights. Those were amazing days. The politicians kept their promise. And the Bill of Rights was added to it. What are those rights? You know them, don't you? Freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, freedom to keep and bear arms. But I hear people all across the country talking about their First Amendment rights and their Second Amendment rights, and I want to stop every one of them. And I say, no, wait a minute, don't talk about it that way. If you say it this way, you'll make a point, and you'll get a lot of people to understand something they need to know. Talk about God-given rights protected by the First, protected by the Second, protected by the Fourth. God-given rights first. See, we didn't get any rights from the First Amendment. All it says is government can't take them away. Congress shall make no law. Now, I also hear people saying the First Amendment's the most important because there's freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and so on. And I disagree with that, too. The most important amendment is the Second, which gives teeth to all the rest. The Second Amendment exists because the War for Independence was begun when the farmers in Massachusetts, in Lexington and Concord, decided that when the government was coming after their guns, the government intended to make them slaves. And any government that wants your gun is a government to be feared. Don't anybody ever give up your gun. Well, there's our nation. There's the United States of America. The greatest experiment in human liberty in all history. And we are its beneficiaries. And practically all of us did nothing at all to enjoy this other than being born in this country. There are people, I would guess, within our audience here tonight who chose to come here. And in some ways, they're really a special kind of an American. Anybody like me, I was born here. I was lucky. But others who came here because they knew that there was something special here. Well, we are the greatest beneficiaries of freedom in all history. And yet we're losing it, aren't we? And we're not losing it to Moscow or to Peking or to Havana. We're losing it to Washington, D.C. What's happening? Well, first of all, they throw God out of the picture, aren't they? No God-given rights? Well, okay, no God-given rights, then where do people think they get their rights? They get them from government. And if government can give you something, it can take it away. That's a very fundamental point there. No national independence. You know, we're supposed to be now, we're all in a global village, whatever that means, right? Centralize all power in Washington. World government, the United Nations, world tyranny facing us, right? This is the way America is being taken. We're turning on the past. And the John Birch Society says it's not an accident. We dare to use that word. Conspiracy. Right? And there are people who say, you know, you people would be a lot better off if you didn't use the word conspiracy. I said, well, give me a substitute for it. That's what it is. Give me a substitute. What is a conspiracy? It's simply a plot among more than one for an evil purpose. Three elements. A plan, more than one person, evil purpose. Why were we allowed to use the word when Richard Nixon was in the Watergate conspiracy? It was okay then, wasn't it? Well, you people are indicting some of the leaders of our nation. Well, who do you think's doing this to us? You know, remember what James Forrestal said? If they were all mistakes, they would have made a few in our favor. Now, who's doing this to us? Who are some of the people that are doing what I've described? Well, let's look at the President of the United States, Mr. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton accepted the Democrat nomination in 1992 in a speech that was broadcast to the nation on television. And in that speech, he mentioned his professor with great honor. He paid homage to him, a man named Carroll Quigley. Now, Carroll Quigley, as soon as he said Carroll Quigley, every member of the Birch Society from coast to coast said, "Did you hear what he said?" He said Carroll Quigley. We knew who Carroll Quigley was. So who was he? Well, he's the man who wrote this book, Tragedy and Hope, 1,350 pages, a history of the world in our time. I carry it around with me. I call it Carroll Quigley's Revenge. Right? Came out in 1966. Bill Clinton was a sophomore at Georgetown University. He was a professor at Georgetown University. What does the book say? The book describes a secret society, and that's Quigley's term, to rule the world. Now, what's interesting about Quigley is that he never used the word conspiracy because he didn't think it was evil. He thought that this was a beneficial thing to mankind, that a few people should rule the world, and that the world would be better off if the brilliant and the intelligent and the privileged ran the world. Now, he describes this secret society as having been formed at Oxford University in England beginning in 1870. I would go beyond that in history. I think that this is merely a fruit of a larger problem that went behind that Quigley doesn't know about. And what he's talking about here, he's honestly telling everybody. He talked about 1870, Oxford University, and the arrival on the campus of a professor named John Ruskin, who took the place by storm. And he told all the undergraduates that they were the members of a privileged and ruling class, and that they were the possessors of a great rule of law and of beauty and of tradition and excellence, and that the world would be far better off if it were run by them. And there was no one amongst all of his students who was more taken and more captivated with this message than a young fellow named Cecil Rhodes, who later, with the help of the Rothschild banking empire in Europe, went to southern Africa, exploited the diamond and gold mines, and became fabulously wealthy. One of the wealthiest persons who ever lived. And it was Rhodes who organized the secret society. The purpose, Quigley tells us, the purpose is centered on the desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all of the habitable portions of the world under their control. And they formed an inner circle, and then they formed an outer circle, and that is a conspiratorial tactic right there. Right? You have people at the outer circle who don't know what the inner circle, don't even know it exists, and you're even deceiving the people who are carrying out your goals. The inner circle they formed in 1891. The outer circle they formed in 1919 when they established the Royal Institute of International Affairs in England, and then similar institutes in the British Dominion countries, Australia and New Zealand and South Africa. And in America, he says, where it is known as the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations. Now, we've got books on the subject back there. The Council on Foreign Relations today is 3,000 members, private organization in New York City on Park Avenue. It has 3,000 members. About 400 of them are agents of the Clinton administration. There are top leaders of every organ of the mass media in our country. The top leaders of the print, the electronic, all different kinds of, the magazines, the newspapers, the television, radio networks, right across the board. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and so forth. The leaders are all members of this same Council on Foreign Relations. And so are military leaders in our country and leading teachers, academicians, and corporate giants as well. Corporate giants who are involved in the international business and so on. And it really is who's who, almost, in America, although there are some decent people in who's who. I don't mean to condemn everybody in that. Quigley tells us they were constantly harping on the lessons to be learned from the failure of the American Revolution. Now, I hope that kind of grates on you as much as it does on me. I don't think it was a failure. I think it was a grand success. But they didn't. They wanted to get us back under England. Now, they finally gets around in 300 pages down the road here. We're talking now, what's the overall goal of the secret society that they're forming? And he tells us. Nothing, excuse me, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Excuse me a second here. I've been out speaking too much, I guess. All right, let's go over that. Nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Is that not consistent with Meyer Amschel Rothschild's "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws"? Key in it is in private hands. See? Nothing less to create a world system of financial control in private hands, and then they dominate the rest of the world. That's their goal. Quigley then tells us later on that he's known of the activities of this network for secret society. He studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records, but he never told us where he went to do that. It would be very interesting to know. And he says that my only problem with this whole thing is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I think its role in history is significant enough to be known. And so the book was intended for academic institutions and for bright young students like Bill Clinton and others who were ambitious and wanted to be part of ruling the world. And all of a sudden it was discovered by the John Birch Society. We started buying up more copies than anybody. And then the publisher, Macmillan, ran out, and Quigley went to them and said, "Of course you're going to reprint." And they said, "Well, we're thinking about it. They never did. Quigley was furious. And he wanted his book out, he wanted the royalties on it, but they never did reprint it because it was being used against their best interests. Well, then Quigley got the rights to it back from him, and he took it to a publisher out on the West Coast, and it is again available. Now, Quigley described the effect of Cecil Rhodes on this whole thing, and he was it. I mean, the whole thing centered around him after a time. And Cecil Rhodes, of course, fabulously wealthy, he left 7 separate wills. Can you imagine? Now, I would guess there's at least a half a dozen people in here who are so wealthy that they're going to leave 7 separate wills, right? I don't see anybody raising his hand, though. Right? And I hope if you do, you'll leave some of it to the John Birch Society. 2 of his wills were left to establish a scholarship program to help train people for the secret society. It's called the Rhodes Scholarship Program. And interestingly, Quigley wrote a second book that was published after he died called The Anglo-American Establishment. And I'll read just one sentence in here because it talks about the Rhodes Scholarship Program. It says here, the scholarships were merely a facade to conceal the secret society. Or, more accurately, they would be one of the instruments by which the members of the secret society could carry out the purposes of Cecil Rhodes. Well, Bill Clinton's a sophomore at Georgetown University, comes very, very involved with Professor Carroll Quigley enough to praise him later on as his mentor. He leaves Georgetown University, he aspires to, and becomes a Rhodes Scholar. He spends a couple of years over in England. He never finished the program. He was running around Europe protesting the war in Vietnam. He came back to America, went to Yale Law School, and that's where he met, what's her name? Went back to Arkansas, became the governor of the state, ingratiating himself into politics, and then was invited to become a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and then was invited to become a member of the Trilateral Commission, its stepchild, and then in 1991 was taken to a meeting of the Bilderbergers. Bilderbergers. Right, there's people in the audience, I'm sure, are saying, what the heck is that? Do you get them at Wendy's or McDonald's, or where do you get them? In 1954, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands and his buddy David Rockefeller, who was later to become the head of the Council on Foreign Relations and the founder of the Trilateral Commission, they got together and they said, you know, it'd be a good idea if we got the leaders of the Western world together once a year for an annual meeting, and we'll help plan the world. Simple as that. So they did. And the first meeting that they gathered leaders from the Western European nations and ours was held in 1954 at the Hotel de Bilderberg in Oosterbeek in the Netherlands, and ever since then the annual gathering has been called the Bilderbergers. Not that they ever went back to that hotel. See, every year they meet and they take over a plush resort somewhere and they put up guards around the place. Nobody in, nobody out. And nobody attribute what goes on to the press so that people don't know exactly what's happening. And who goes to it? Well, inconsequential people like the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of all these countries, and politicians, senators, congressmen here, and members of Parliament elsewhere, and leaders in the media and the academic world and corporate giants and so, inconsequential people. They get together. They met in our country. They met at St. Simon's Island in Georgia once. They met at Williamsburg in Virginia. They met at Woodstock in Vermont, Lawrence Rockefeller's place over right here in the neighboring state. In 1991, they met at Baden-Baden in Germany. And Bill Clinton was brought before them and showcased. And he obviously got a nod of approval. And he came back to our country and was permitted to be the President of the United States. Now let me say that with due emphasis. He was permitted to be the President of the United States by these people. Is that the way it works? Ladies and gentlemen, that's the way it works. You see, George Bush had been a Bilderberger participant as well. And there have others that have gone there. Dan Quayle went and just didn't get the nod of approval. And Dan Quayle is, I think, a political has-been. But I could be wrong about that. That's the way it has been working for a long, long time. And so Bill Clinton has credentials in all of the different areas that you would expect, where the people who are working for world government and so forth. He's Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, Rhodes Scholarship Program, Bilderberger Movement. Now in 1992, earlier in the year, Bill Clinton had opposition for the Democrat primary, didn't he? He had 5 opponents. He had Jesse Jackson and Jerry Brown and Senator Tsongas from Massachusetts, ex-senator. He had Senator Harkin from Iowa, Senator Kerry from Nebraska. And these guys all wanted the nomination, and Clinton, and any one of them could have gone before the voters and said, look, if you pick Clinton, you're going to get a duplicate of Bush. They both come from the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, Bilderberger meetings. Don't vote for Clinton, vote for me. You get something different than Bush. How many of them did that? None. Not at all. Why? Wouldn't the voters have responded? I think they would have. Well, there are 2 reasons, really. One reason is that they would like those credentials for themselves, and the other reason is they fear the power of that group. They know that if they step on the toes of that group, that things will happen that they won't like. Well, there was an organization formed in 1958 in this country called the John Birch Society that began to step on the toes of some of these people. And what did they respond? Did they say, no, you're wrong about us. We didn't do that. We didn't do that, what you're saying. No, you're wrong about. No, what did they do? They called us every nasty name in the book, didn't they? We're racists and anti-Semites and crackpots and fools and extremists and ultra and like the Nazis and like the Klan and like the communists and everything nasty and dirty that they could say about us, and expected that that would just drive us right out of existence. It didn't. It didn't take. It didn't do the job. I mean, there's a lot of people in our country, of course, who still think that they know enough about the Birch Society because they heard that 25 years ago. And a lot of them are beginning to come around. And a lot of them are saying, wait a minute, I don't trust the press. The press told me that this is what the Birch Society said. This is the way the Birch Society is. Maybe I ought to take a look at the Birch Society. And our audiences are swelling and more interested in what we're doing. See, we not only went and talked about it like this and this and this, we went to the top of the roof and we shouted it out to the country. And that's what has to be done. What is the goal? What do they really want? Very simply, they want the New World Order. Now, when George Bush started using that phrase in 1990, as soon as he said it, same thing happened all across the country. Members of the Birch Society said, did you hear what he said? He said New World Order. Why? Well, 25 years before that, our founder, Robert Welch, had told us New World Order is the slogan and the determined goal of a powerful conspiracy, and it means political control through world government and economic control through socialism. We knew. And every time George Bush mentioned it, didn't he say he wanted to reinvigorate the United Nations? Completely consistent with what Robert Welch had told us. Well, I go on a lot of radio shows, and happy to be on one here in the capital city area today, and grateful. Over the last couple of years, however, I've been on a lot of shows where a guy, talk show man, would say, sometimes a little snidely and sometimes a little humor in his voice, he'd say, oh, well, we're glad to have a representative of the Birch Society today, Mr. McManus. Welcome to the show. My question for you is very simple. What's the Birch Society doing now that communism's dead? Ha ha ha. Yeah. And my response would be, what do you mean communism's dead? It's alive in China and Cuba and North Korea and Berkeley, California and Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'd say to him, you're talking, of course, about that vast empire that just imploded called the USSR, which stood for the Union of Soviet Communist Republics, didn't it? No, it didn't. Right? Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And of course, I tell him, if a communist decides to stop calling himself a communist and instead just calls himself a socialist, do you really think it's time to run up the victory flag? And I'd ask them, and sometimes they'd say to me, okay, define socialism, or I'd ask them to define it, let me define it. I say, oh, okay, socialism, that's economic control of the people by government, and it means taxation, regulations, controls, bureaucracy, and big brother government. And invariably, before I finish, he's saying to me, but that's what we're getting here in our country, and I say, thank you very much, you've made my case. That has happened many times. It's an absolute delight to be able to help these people understand what's happening. I sometimes say, well, why don't you ask me the difference between a communist and a socialist? They say, okay, what's the difference? I say, it's easy. Communist is a socialist in a hurry. See, a communist means to take the Communist Manifesto and all of the principles involved in it and impose them on you in a lightning takeover. Right? And when he does that, he's got immediately 95 to 99% of the population are his enemies, and they resist as much as they can. So he has to build KGBs and gulags and knocks on the door in the middle of the night and terror and so forth. But a socialist who has the very same goal, he works more slowly. And he gets you to vote yourself into the condition, and he destroys resistance in the process. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what's happening to the United States of America. We don't face a communist takeover. We face voting ourselves into socialism. Now, I said that this is the same goal. This is the Communist Manifesto. We published the Constitution of the United States. We published the Communist Manifesto. We want people to read this thing. If you read it, what do you see? You see the program for the socialists. In fact, in 1888, it was reissued by the communists themselves and the socialists with a new preface from Engels. Marx was already in his grave in 1888. This is 40 years after it was first published. A new preface by Engels, and it says here, when it was written, we would not like to have called it the Socialist Manifesto, but we didn't for many reasons, one of which was there were some quacks running around Europe at the time calling themselves socialists, and we didn't want to associate with them. So we called it the Communist Manifesto. It's been the Bible, if you'll pardon the expression, of every communist and every socialist since 1848. It was written for the purpose of gathering all of the socialist groups in Europe under one umbrella. Now, some of them are in a hurry, and those are the communists. And the communists and socialists have fought over this thing. What does it say? It says, well, the theory can be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. You can lose it bang, or you can lose it in increments, as we are losing it in increments. What else does it say? It says, abolish the family. Any attacks on the family in our country? Right? What about the homosexual movement? What about the fact that a lot of families now have to have two breadwinners? Mom and dad both have to work. It hurts the family. One to pay the taxes and the other to get the money to run the family. It says here, an explicit attack on home education when we replace home education by social. They don't want homeschooling. Explicit in the Communist Manifesto. Bourgeois marriage has to go, right? We have to abolish countries and nationalities. We have to abolish all eternal truths, all religion, all morality. And then we get to the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, all listed here on page 25 of this issue. Look down those and you'll see what's happening to our country. Number 2, the heavy progressive income tax. We have it. Number 5, the Federal Reserve. There it is. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. That's the Federal Reserve. But what we have in our country is one step beyond even what Marx said. He said in the hands of the state, we've got it in the hands of a private group. What else is in the Communist Manifesto? Abolition of property and land. Any problems with land ownership in this state? Talk to them out west. How about abolition of the rights of inheritance? That's here. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what's happening. And this is what they've taken an oath to. And I contend that if you took these two and you took the covers off both, and you put them in front of some congressmen and some senators, they wouldn't know the difference. They wouldn't know the difference. In fact, if you said, which of these is the one that we are guided by, they would look at this one and they would say, oh, let's see here. All right, progressive income tax, yeah, centralization of credit, yeah, the Federal Reserve, free education, all children in public schools, abolish rights of inheritance, yeah, this is ours, right? That's what they say, right? But ladies and gentlemen, this is the one they've sworn the oath to. And if they don't abide by that oath, we've got nobody to blame but ourselves. We should hold their feet to the fire. So, New World Order, socialism, world government. How do you get the American people to give up what they have and allow that to happen to them? Well, first of all, you send them to the schools where they're not allowed to teach these principles. They're not allowed at all to teach that we have a God and He gave us our rights, and that the purpose is limited government as given by the Constitution, the purpose of government. Well, you can get a lot of other people to go along with this if you corrupt them. And a lot of people have been corrupted, haven't they? You get corrupted, you'll do the will of those who corrupted you. A lot of people have been bought. Government programs, government grants, government this, government, even corporations, not just persons, corporations. That's why we see corporate leaders involved in this world gathering of power in one repository. But the greatest way to get people in this country to accept the ideas that we're talking about here, the New World Order, has been to scare them. And the greatest scare in my lifetime and in yours has been communism, hasn't it? Communists have missiles. They aimed them at our cities, and the American people were told communism is a great and monstrous threat, and we've got to be careful about that. It might be a good idea if we sacrificed our sovereignty and got into a world government that would control everybody so that we wouldn't have to worry about nuclear missiles. They even had a slogan, didn't they? Better red than dead. There's a wonderful set of alternatives for you. You can live under communism, or you can be an ash in a nuclear holocaust. And a lot of people submitted to that. But the John Birch Society began 25 or more years ago to start spreading the word that those communist missiles were American-made. That we gave them the plans, the parts, the technology, the equipment, the computers, the money, and everything they needed to build that missile capability to aim at us. And we spread out tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of pieces of literature all over this country to get people aware of it. And communism, all of a sudden, isn't being the threat anymore. Now, am I saying that that's the reason? Because of our success in showing the fraudulent nature of those communist missiles? I'm not saying it for certain, but it's possible. Why else? So communism really isn't the threat that it was anymore. I'm not saying it's not a problem. It could come back tomorrow from Red China. It could come back from Russia even. We don't know. But it's not being used there. So what's the next threat that they have? What's the next way to scare you and me into accepting their rule? Well, the next threat is environmentalism. Right? They talk about global warming, and global warming can only be solved by an international control over what you and I do. You see, you and I are burning too much fuel in our automobiles and in our factories and in our homes, and we're putting up soot over the atmosphere here, and all of a sudden it's forming a canopy, and then the heat that's generated can't go off into space, and the Earth is heating up here, and pretty soon the polar ice caps are going to melt, and when they do, you're going to have beachfront property in Albany, New York. Right? Well, it doesn't get that ridiculous, but it gets almost that ridiculous. Ladies and gentlemen, for over 100 years, temperature readings have been taken, tens of thousands of them every single day, all around the globe. The data is available, and it shows that there is no cooling, and there is no warming, and this whole global warming business is absolute hokum. Absolute hokum. And of course, anybody in this part of the country in 1994 would hardly be talking about global warming, would you? Now, you know what else? Ozone depletion is just as hokum. And a lot of this other stuff, too. And they'll use all these environmental concerns, right? They're worried about the little furry thing going under the road because then they have to shut down this big project that somebody wants to build and make some factories and make some progress or something like that. And endangered species everywhere. Shut down the logging industry up in the Northwest. Do this, do that, everywhere you turn. You can bring our country to its knees with environmental hysteria, and it's a very big problem. And happily, there are scientists speaking out about it, and scientists who usually speak to each other in their own journals are now going to the general public. And there's some wonderful books out by some really competent scientists who are very, very upset about this bogus science that's being given to us all across the country. But where did this all start? How did this environmental hysteria get going? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it happened in New York State, a little place north of the city called Iron Mountain. And 15 individuals began meeting in 1962, and they met on and off for a period of 3 years. And the purpose of the 3 years of gatherings was to develop an alternative to nuclear weapons as a way to control mankind. At the end of 1965, after 3 years, they put together a report that was not for publication. It was to just simply spread them out amongst themselves and their peers, the people who wanted the New World Order. But one of the 15, John Kenneth Galbraith, took it to a publisher, and it was published. He's the only one of the 15 that we've ever found out. We don't know who the others were. We may never know. But we have the report. The report from Iron Mountain. Let me read just one sentence here, and you'll see the birth of the environmental hysteria in our country. They say here, it may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. They even said apparent threat, didn't they? See, they were honest. This wasn't for publication. Let me read that again. It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. There it is. Now, a lot of people would love to have this. It's out of print, the report from Iron Mountain. But we have a wonderful book back there about the United Nations and all the threat involved in that. It's called Global Tyranny by my colleague Bill Jasper. And he's got a couple of sections in there where he talks about the Iron Mountain report at great length. And if you need that information, I hope you do, you can get it in that book. All right, so the environmental thing now, all of a sudden these scientists speaking out and they're saying, no, don't allow yourself to lose your freedom chasing this shadow, because it's just a shadow. It's not really a real problem. So then, okay, what's the next threat? We see the threat of communism, and it's essentially fraudulent. We see the threat of environmentalism, and it's fraudulent. The next threat is debt, and it's not fraudulent. The United States government now owes $4.5 trillion national debt. And you say that, and people say, I have no idea what that means. $4.5 trillion. Well, let's try to make it intelligible. If I owed $1 trillion, not 4.5, if I owed $1 trillion and I meant to pay it off at the rate of $1 million a day, every day, without worrying about interest, it would take me 2,740 years to do it. That's what $1 trillion is. It's $1 million. Now, because of that $4.5 trillion, we have a $300 billion debt, interest debt, every year. We have to pay $300 billion in interest on that debt. And you and I have to pay it. But again, it's kind of meaningless. It's such a large number. What does it mean? Well, there's 250 million of us. Let's divide it, right? A little long division, we get what? $1,200 for every man, woman, and child. But not everyone pays taxes. So you factor out those who don't pay taxes, children and others, and you got about half. So double the figure. $2,400 for every taxpayer every year just for interest on the national debt, and it's going up. And it doesn't pay the president's salary or the Marine Corps or anything else. It doesn't even reduce the debt. It's just for interest. Can a government gain control of you that way? See, debt is followed by borrowing, and borrowing is followed by interest, and interest is followed by the need for taxation to pay the interest, and the taxation comes when the government takes control of you. Indeed. Well, we get a $200, $300 billion adding to the deficit every year. And President Clinton just gave us his new budget. He says it's got a $176 billion red ink in the new budget. I've held it below $200 billion. Aren't I wonderful? It's Alice in Wonderland. So as if they say 176 billion, it's going to be 250, maybe 300. It always goes much more than they said. But they give away money. They still have a foreign aid program. Foreign aid program, $13 billion. We station troops in foreign nations, and we absorb their defense budget as ours. We have troops in Japan. They're an economic giant. We have troops in South Korea. They're an economic power. We pay the bills. We have troops in Germany. They're an economic power. We have them in Macedonia. We have them in the Middle East. We have them in Somalia. I just heard that they're coming back from Colombia, and I didn't even know we had any in Colombia. So what do we do about that? Well, let's realize that it's terribly, terribly expensive. And secondly, it's greasing the skids for entrance into the New World Order under the United Nations. So what do we do about it? Very simple. We bring the troops home. All of them. Bring the troops home. You bet you I'm an isolationist. I prefer to be called a non-interventionist. We used to say that a liberal is somebody who's generous with other people's money, and we can still say that, can't we? And now we find them generous with other people's sons and daughters and fathers and husbands and so forth. Incredible. Should the United States military be the UN's global cop? No thanks. I was on a show recently and they said, should Poland have a seat in NATO? And I said, yes. Give them ours. Bill Clinton is one of a lot of presidents, keeps telling us that he's doing everything he possibly can to cut spending, right? I got a wonderful headline here in the newspaper. It says, Clinton vows more trims in spending, right? That's as good as his marriage vow. Look at this one here. Some economists defend deficit spending. Economists, right? Somebody says, McManus, where do you get off writing a book about economics? I said, I didn't study it in college. That qualifies me. Right? You know, I got an attitude about economists. If you took all the economists in the United States and you laid them end to end, that would be fine. What are they doing instead? Well, now they want health care. You know, you can sum up the health care thing in one sentence, right? If you think health care is expensive today, just wait till it's free. Hillary Clinton went up to Congress. I guess I'm supposed to call her Hillary Rodham Clinton. I'm sorry, I forgot. Out west, they say Washington, D.C. is Rodham and Gomorrah, right? She went up to Congress to sell this health care program that they put together, and she's telling them that she's going to have small and business, all businessmen are going to have to finance this thing for every one of their employees to the tune of 80%. The company is going to have to pay that much money. And some of the congressmen said, Mrs. Clinton, you must realize that what you're saying here is going to destroy a lot of small and medium-sized businesses in this country. Listen to her incredible response. She said, I cannot be responsible for saving every undercapitalized entrepreneur in America. But she can be responsible for destroying them. Right? She should have been thrown out of Capitol Hill right on the spot, maybe even out of this country. They don't intend to cut the deficit. They don't intend to pay off the debt. They don't intend to reduce the tax burden. They don't intend to allow us to be free. Which brings me to my book. Financial Terrorism, Hijacking America Under the Threat of Bankruptcy. The threat, not bankruptcy itself. The threat of bankruptcy. What they intend to do is to bring us up to the door of the dollar losing credibility, losing value, losing. And then they come forward and say, well, look, our friends at the UN have a real good solution here. We better take this chance while we got it. Let's have a new monetary system. Let's have world monetary system, world government, the New World Order. That's the plan. Now, how do I know that that's the plan? Well, I've quoted them saying that. They've been saying it for many years. A lot of them have been saying it. Here's Brzezinski saying it in 1970. More intensive efforts to shape a new world monetary structure will have to be undertaken with some consequent risk to the present relatively favorable American position. There it is. Richard Nixon, 1972. There must be a thoroughgoing reform of the world monetary system. We must join with other nations to create and participate in a modern world economic order. All right? And I've got Council on Foreign Relations and trilateral people saying it again and again and again and again, right up till today. C. Fred Bergston is a prominent economic guru in and out of government. He said the world economy is in trouble unless there is some central steering mechanism. There you go. They want a world Federal Reserve system. Nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole, said Carroll Quigley. Well, what are they spending the money for that gets us so heavily in debt? I like to say, I'm glad you're seated. Stand by. $2 million to study why truck drivers lose alertness at the wheel. I could have saved the $2 million. They get tired. $49 million for a rock and roll museum. $500,000 to study the effects of cigarette smoking on dogs. $603,000 for pickle research at North Carolina State University. $2 million for a bicycle path between Arlington and Cambridge in Massachusetts so that the Harvard professors can ride their bikes to work. Okay? It goes on, $500,000 to McDonald's Corporation to promote chicken McNuggets, $2.3 million to Gallo Brothers to promote their wines. It's incredible. In the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, you will read, that's the text of the founding meeting in 1958, Robert Welch said that they will increase the national debt as wildly and as fast as they possibly can, and they will spend money as wastefully as they can for everything conceivable. There you go. Listen to this one here. $1.2 million for African elephant conservation. Elephants, huh? I bet the Republicans were behind that one. United States Institute of Peace, $11 million. That's to get the people of the United States to be interested in peace. What an insult, right? People don't start wars, governments start wars. They send the people to fight and die in the wars. If they spent the $11 million to get the governments to stop making wars, I'd be willing to go along with it. All right, one more. They got the national, they $34 million for the National Fertilizer Research Center. They had to locate that on Capitol Hill, I think. I've got a chapter here I call it Economic Freedom. It's the missing alternative. See, they're constantly parading before us false alternatives. The false alternatives, more debt or world government. Are there no other alternatives? I start the chapter off with Shakespeare. He said in Taming of the Shrew, he said, there's small choice in rotten apples. Well put, Will. What are the good apples? Economic freedom. Pay off the debt. Leave the people alone. And on we go. I've got several sections here about inflation, but we've talked about that. Now, the thing in my book that people have told me they enjoy the most is where I picture currency. I've got pictures of what's been used in the United States in the 20th century. I got 5 of them. The first 2 are U.S. Treasury notes. First is a gold certificate. Back in the 20s, you get a gold certificate and it says redeemable in gold on demand to the bearer of that piece of paper. And it was good as gold, the finest paper money the world has ever known. Then we went to silver certificates. And they said redeemable in silver on demand. You could get silver for those. Shortly after the Federal Reserve was formed now, the Federal Reserve starts issuing currency. And the first of the Federal Reserve notes issued side by side with U.S. Treasury notes, so it had to say on it redeemable in gold. And it did. And the people said, well, Federal Reserve, U.S. Treasury note, one's as good as the other, and the acceptance of Federal Reserve notes began. But in 1933, President Roosevelt said we couldn't own gold anymore, so then the Fed had to put out a new kind, and the next kind they put out said redeemable in lawful money. And then we tell the story about the man and took a $50 bill and on it said redeemable in lawful money, and he went to the bank and he put it up on the counter and he asked the girl, he said, young lady, I'd like some lawful money for my 50. And she looked at him and she said, you want 5 10s or 10 5s? He said, no, miss, if you look on that currency you want to give me there, it too says redeemable in lawful money. If it's redeemable in lawful money, it can't be lawful money. That's logical. I'd like some lawful money, please. She went and got the boss. Well, the boss came back and he said, they haggled for a while, and he finally said, well, what is it that you want, sir? He said, well, the Constitution says gold and silver. Am I going to get any of that? No. He says, good, give me back my 50. You've proved my point. And out the door he went. So then we went to the fifth of the five, the kind of currency you have in your pocket, in your purse today, and it says on it, redeemable in, no, it doesn't say redeemable at all, does it? It says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, redeemable in nothing. Nothing. And in my lifetime plus 2 years, we have gone in this country from the finest paper money the world has ever known to totally irredeemable paper issued by a private bank. I heard a tape recently of a fella, and it was really humorous the way he put this point over. And it's a really good point. He said he went to a gas station and he filled up his car with gasoline, and then he went in and he asked the girl who was behind the cash register there, he said, young lady, I'm sorry to tell you that all I have to pay for the gas is non-redeemable note on a private bank. Will you take that? And she said, gee, I don't think so. And she said, let me call the boss. It was a Sunday. The boss was home. He's watching a football game or something. So she rings him up on the phone, and she says, there's a man here, and he wants to pay for his gas with a non-redeemable note on a private bank. And you could hear over the phone, no! So the guy puts some Federal Reserve notes up on his thing, and she says, I'll take those. He said, you just told me you wouldn't. Because they are non-redeemable notes on a private bank. Well, there's where we are, folks. Now, we can still use these Federal Reserve notes, can't we? But isn't their value continually being eroded? Fewer and fewer goods in your basket at the supermarket for the same amount of money, year after year after year? Yes, indeed. Well, we got several other sections in the book. I talk about the history of banking. I talk about Andrew Jackson and what he did for us. I talk about the entitlements problem that we got in this country. All we got to do is what Chile did. Chile privatized the Social Security system and the health care program. They told the people, if you want to stay in the program, we'll continue to pay it off. You put a lot of money into it. This is what I recommend for our country. I don't want to abolish it. There are people dependent on it. We keep paying them. But we give everybody else the option of leaving the program. And then you get in your private program, and you'll find you get a tremendous, much more benefit out of it for a lot less money. And all the money you put into those private programs then becomes a pool of wealth that people can borrow and build industries and so forth, as they have done in Chile, and Chile has just taken off. It's the envy of all of its neighbors in Latin America. In fact, they called Chile El Boom. El Boom. And what I've just described could be done tomorrow in the United States of America, if they would do it. Well, we talk a lot about the problem, and here we are. We've talked about the problem at length, maybe too long. All right, what's the solution? Is there a solution? What can we do about this? Well, in my book, it's chapter 13, Lucky 13. We got the solution. And the solution is very simple, very easy to understand. I've always said that the essence of brilliance is simplicity, and we have a very simple solution to the problem. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it is simple. It's simple to understand. It's simple to carry out. And it begins by going right back to the Constitution of the United States. That's still there. It's still there. Which is why we don't want a constitutional convention. Open up that for a constitutional convention, kiss it goodbye. We go to Article 1, Section 7, and it says very simply, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. Stop right there. If the House of Representatives will not originate a bill to fund the foreign aid, the United Nations, the Department of Education, the Bureau of this, the Commission of that, the agency of something else, there's nothing the President, the Senate, the courts, or anybody else can do about it. The power of the purse is in the House of Representatives, deliberately done by our founding fathers. Give it to the body of government closest to the people, and you can change them every second year. The power of the purse is there. So, there's step one. Step two is to get enough members of the House of Representatives to say, we're not going to fund this. We're not going to fund that. You don't even have to repeal the legislation. Just stop funding it. All right, so step two, how do we get enough members of the House of Representatives to want to do that? Well, the way to do it is we put out trim bulletins. We put out these tax reform immediately, trim bulletins, on every congressman all across the United States. And we just simply report on how did they vote on spending bills. Did they vote for high taxes and more government, as this fellow did, and he gets all X's down this column? Or did he vote for low taxes and less government? And if he did that, he gets stars all down in this column. And you can see these two congressmen are totally opposite, aren't they? On every single measure, he voted no. On every single measure, he voted, let's spend this country into the poorhouse. So we put these out all across the country. Now, this fella here, all the X's, he's from Connecticut. Sam Guy-Jensen. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. What a surprise. Here's Richard Gephardt of Missouri, all X's. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. All right, but this fella here, all stars from Illinois, all stars from Arizona, all stars from Wisconsin, all stars from New York. Solomon from New York. Whoa! Now, wide distribution of these things helps a lot of people to know whether they want to vote for or against somebody. And we don't tell them to vote for or against. We just say, here's what they did. We don't even say if they're Republicans or Democrats, and it doesn't matter. Right? So a lot of people who might want high taxes would vote for this fella. And if you don't want high taxes, you'd probably vote for this fellow, or vice versa. You could do what you want. You get the facts, ma'am, as they used to say on that television program. Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Now, what can happen? Well, here's a trim bulletin for a congresswoman from Missouri named Joan Kelly Horn. All right, this is in 1992, and her record was almost always X's. On this particular one, she got a star, and I think a couple of people fainted when they saw that, right? All right, so they distribute these things all over the district. They come out 3 times a year, the same for all 435 congressmen, the same issues, and everybody is rated on it. Did they vote high taxes or low taxes? All right. So on this particular one, they distributed, as they did the others, each of them, all during 1992. They bought space in the local newspaper. They inserted them at their expense. They put them on, others, they wrapped them in a little plastic. They put them next to the newspaper in the driveway in the morning, or they hung them on the door, or they went to the county fair and they passed them out. They set up tables at the shopping centers. Everybody in the district got it. So election day came in 1992, and she became unemployed. Her successor, the first time we reported trim for the successor, all stars. Can it be done? I just showed you it can be done. And that same thing happened in a district in South Carolina, and in another one in Alabama, and another one in Oklahoma, and another one in Pennsylvania, and another one in Minnesota. And in Iowa, there were 2 congressmen who were forced to run side by side against each other because they'd lost a seat in redistricting, and so 2 incumbents had to run for 1 seat. One of them had all X's in his trim bulletin, the other had all stars, and the people in the district simply took out a great big ad in the local newspaper, put the 2 bulletins side by side, let the people see the difference. Guess who won? And that's happening all across the country, ladies and gentlemen. You know, one of my predecessors in the leadership of the John Birch Society was a congressman from Georgia named Larry McDonald. And he was aboard KAL 007 in 1983, and we never saw him again. He had served 5 terms in Congress, and he was a force. And he used to tell us when we'd ask him, what's it like up there? He said, you don't want to know, but let me tell you this much. He said, most of the congressmen don't have an ideology. All they're interested in is staying in office. He said, if you wanted to, you could add up the numbers of those who are always going to vote for socialism. They're always going to vote for the Marxist program, more government. Maybe 110, 150, maybe 125 of them. He said, you go to the other side, he said, you'll find that there's a whole bunch of them that will always vote the correct way, or nearly all of the time. And he said, there's 50, 60, 75 of them. So he said, take the high number there and the high number there, 125, 75, you got 200. There's 435 congressmen. That means 235 in the middle. No ideology, just want to stay elected. And he used to talk about the wet finger test. He said they always do this. They wet their finger, they put it up, and they find out which way the breeze is coming because that's the side that's cold. He said, it's time for us to generate the breeze from this side. Now, that can be done with trim. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm convinced that trim can terrorize Congress into supporting its oath to the Constitution if we will use that tool. Let's suppose that in 1994 that there are 15 or 18 more of these situations where the people, because of trim, have decided to change Congress. Let's suppose that in 1996 there's 15 or 18 or 20 more, because of trim, have decided to change the representation in Congress. If that could be done, ladies and gentlemen, I contend that that's all that would be necessary. That the rest of them would be absolutely terrorized about the possibility of trim putting up an operation in their district. Isn't that possible? Can't we do that? Why not? It's already been done in so many places. I know that Jerry Solomon keeps a pile of trim bulletins on his desk in his office, or in his receptionist, or someplace in his office. And people come by and they want him to vote for this and this and this and this, and he says, take one of those trim bulletins. He said, I'm more concerned about what the constituents think than what you think. Get out of here. Huh? Just imagine that kind. You know, what needs to be done in our country is to change the momentum. The momentum is to go more government, big government, world government, taxes, and so change the momentum so that it goes the other way. It's a monstrous undertaking, but here's the tool that can bring it about, called trim. There are congressmen who raise as much as $1 million to get a seat in Congress, or to retain a seat in Congress. $50,000 worth of trim bulletins is really all anybody needs. Isn't there that kind of money available amongst decent, honorable Americans throughout this country? Of course there is. See, I travel the country and I get to see the operations that are going on around this country, and it's just absolutely thrilling, right? Down in Virginia, they have a pretty big trim operation, so they put out a pretty big trim bulletin, see? And I thought that was as big as it could possibly be until I got down to North Carolina, where they have a really big trim bulletin, right? Look at this one here. Here's a congressman. He's got 1 star and all the rest are X's. 50,000 of these were printed, inserted in the local newspaper, and distributed, and 4 days later he announced his retirement. Can the job be done? I just told you it can be done. I just showed you how. Now, who's going to do this? Who's going to organize it other than the members of the John Birch Society? And every one of these bulletins says it's from the John Birch Society, ultimately. I mean, there's been several cases where a congressman at one of his town meetings where they passed out the trim bulletins, he stood up and he said, oh, I don't want anybody to pay attention to this material. It's from the John Birch Society. And the guy jumped up in the back of the room and he says, yeah, I know, it says so on every one of them, right? The John Birch Society is the answer, folks, right? They're the ones that will organize this. And if you really mean to save your country, you join the Birch Society. And then you get involved in helping to get other people who don't have enough courage to do that, to get involved at least in the trim committee. I like to say, if you're going to play baseball, you want to be in the major leagues. And if you're going to save your country, you want to be in the major leagues too. And that's the Birch Society. And so, join us. You won't be sorry. Now, let me give you some hope. We go to a lot of Birch meetings over the years, and I've done this myself. I come and I talk about the problem and the problem and the problem and the problem, and I urge everybody to get involved and help us solve this problem. We got to do it. You go out of the meeting and you go, you know, you're weighted down, and it's all information that's honest and true and real. But let me digress a little from that kind of a pattern tonight. Let me give you some hope, real hope, other than what I've already given you, which is a lot of hope. I got 5 good reasons for hope. And I'm not a Pollyanna. All right, what's the hope? Well, the first reason is that if you're out working and you're doing something that's important and it's effort and it's moral and it's decent and it's needed and you ask for God's help, I can't imagine you won't get it. But if you sit back and you say, God, we got a terrible problem here, please solve it, and you don't even lift a finger, I can't imagine that God likes that. I don't mean to speak for God. But my mother always said, God helps those that help themselves, and that's a simple way of saying what I just said. And so work as if it all depends on God, on yourself, and then pray as if it all depends on God, and do them both at the same time, and then you'll see real success. Second reason for hope is history is made by the dedicated few. Small groups of people will always succeed against the disorganized, that don't care. Nobody knows that better than the conspiracy. There's not many of them. You got 3,000 members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'll bet you 10% of them, or fewer, are conspirators. And the rest of those people just simply go along to get along. All they're interested in doing is feathering their own nest, and they throw themselves in with those who can build them a bigger job or a bigger position or whatever. History is made by the dedicated few, so let's make it. Third reason for hope: there's more good people than bad people. Plenty of good people in this country. Find them, help them, show them, get them involved. They want to be involved. They're worried about their country. They're worried about their children, what kind of a future they're going to have. And they can be approached, and they can be enlisted, and we can save our country with them. The fourth reason for hope is we've got truth on our side. What an advantage! Can you imagine? We've got truth on our side. An ounce of truth overcomes a ton of falsehood. If you will wield it, if you will use it, and don't just hold it in tight and say, oh, it's great, we have the truth. You got to shout it from the rooftops. And if you do, people will respond. The fifth reason for hope is that it is a conspiracy. Imagine, even the fact that it is a conspiracy is reason for hope, because if it's not being done deliberately, a conspiracy, then it's the unfolding of historical forces that nobody can stop, and that is Marxist rubbish. That's economic determinism. Forget it. Things happen because men want them to happen. What is being done by some can be undone by others. Let's undo it. There's 5 solid reasons for hope. Okay, let's wind this up. I'll wind it up by referring to somebody who's become a hero of mine. That's a great artist named Michelangelo. Great sculptor. 400 years ago, Michelangelo took a discarded block of marble, 14 feet high. Nobody else wanted to use it because it had a little bit of a flaw in it, see? But Michelangelo said, may I have it, may I have it? And he started working on that 14-foot-high block of marble, and every day he would work on it, and he'd chink away with his little hammer and chisel. That's how he did it. He didn't have this mechanical stuff back then. And a little boy in the neighborhood used to come by, and he'd look into him, and he'd say, what's he doing? Every day he'd come, and he's still chinking away. And the boy finally said, this guy's going nowhere. And he stopped coming by. And about a year and a half later, he came back, and he looked in, and there was the magnificent statue of David. And in all innocence, the boy looked at Michelangelo, and he said, how did you know he was in there? Well, Michelangelo knew because he had a vision. And the vision spawned the labor, and it made up for the time and the effort and the seemingly endless labors here. All that chinking away and so little to show for it, but then finally it began to take shape and then form, and then he roughed it down, and then he polished it off, and he had his magnificent masterpiece, didn't he? Because he was willing to work hard enough and long enough and smart enough to see his vision become reality. Well, we in the John Birch Society have a vision too. And our vision is to see a Congress of the United States taking that oath and meaning it. We have a vision of the government being limited by the Constitution to its very, very well spelled out functions and no more. And the government becoming 20% its size and 20% its cost, because that is in force. And we have a vision of them going to Washington to repeal legislation and defund things and get us back to being free citizens again. So much so that we now have surpluses. For many years, we pay off the national debt, and then we repeal the income tax, and we get rid of the Federal Reserve System. Those are all elements of our vision. We have a vision of 15, 18, 20 more congressmen who are willing to do it correctly in 1994, and then the same number in 1996, and that would be enough. The momentum would change. And when Congress meets in 1997 and starts the new session, it's a whole new ballgame. And then we sit down and we write a letter to every senator on trim stationery, and we say, dear senators, we're about to start trim for the U.S. Senate. Stand by, yours truly. And then by the year 2000, we could even see elected to the highest office in the land somebody who every person in this room would be proud to call the President of the United States of America. You know something? It can be done. If you and audiences like it and people who will meet us via videotape or whatever, if people like you all across the United States will simply do it, the vision can become reality. And we can pass on to our children and theirs and all the generations yet to come the marvelous legacy of freedom that was earned for us without one bit of effort on our part 200 plus years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, join the Birch Society. As Robert Welsh so often said, come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. And thank you very much.